Okay, welcome to the Graybeard Live. This is Bruce Buxton. I am the Graybeard, joined today, as you can see, by Mr. Dan Lewis, our young phenom from Block Island, Massachusetts, and I'm so glad you could join us today, Dan. Sorry.
All good. No, thanks, Bruce. And quick point of clarification there: Block Island, Rhode Island.
It's Rhode Island, not Massachusetts. Well, there you
No,
go.
it is Rhode Island, but you're right to be a bit confused because I spend a decent amount of time up in Boston, Mass, as well. So
we're going to cover a little bit of that ground here, I hope. It's funny when you were when I was getting ready today. I have a podcast too called the Graybeard Podcast, and it's a lifestyle podcast. It's not a GIS podcast. And the other day, I became aware that there's two guys down in Fredericksburg, Virginia, that have a podcast they call the Graybeard Chronicles. So I looked them up, and I looked at their website, and these guys both have these big long beards. One guy's totally bald, and he's got a beard down to his chest. The other guy's got a nice fluffy beard and gray hair. And I started thinking, what I need to do is call myself the itty bitty can't grow a gray beard. Right? Like this is the best it gets. So it's gray, but it's short. So anyway.
So did those folks reach out to you and say, Bruce, you're on my turf with the gray beard, or was this very congenial?
I reached out to them and said, hey, this was totally unintentional. Let's collaborate, but I haven't heard back from them yet, so we'll find out. Anyway, hey, listen. So we've got a couple of viewers. Jamie and Mike are on right now, so welcome you guys. Dan, one of the things we were talking about is that how the pandemic has kind of changed the way that we do our work. And it wasn't that many months ago, back in before March, that you and I were probably on an airplane as much as we were in our cars. How have you negotiated that? How have you determined you're going to deal with that?
Yeah, it sure seemed like quaint times not so long ago. And I think one of those last few trips I did, I think you and I actually crossed paths at a nearby a customer site in Ohio, believe it or not. So
yep.
Funny that when travel kind of stopped in the spring, I had just ended maybe 8 weeks of travel in a row, which is a bit more than I usually do, but I was enjoying it. It was with wonderful customers and business partners and colleagues. So it was a nice stretch. Of course, I didn't know what was yet to come. So got that in and in the time being, come mid-March, and home base for me is usually out of Boston with family. And but we both have collective family on Block Island, little island off the coast of Rhode Island. And in mid-March, we got our typical summer place started a little early.
The rest of us could have been so smart, right? And we could have worked from anywhere. And you went to Block Island, and you've been there in that idyllic setting now for what, 7-8 months?
It's been a good 7-month stretch, back and forth to Boston a few times, but mostly here. And March, April, and May it was cold and wet, and October starts to get that way. But summer was a fine time. We felt very fortunate.
That's awesome. Hey, I want to get into this discussion, but I want to ask you: Does Block Island have a GIS? There's a municipality on Block Island, right? Do they have a GIS?
Yeah, it's funny, they do, and it started in the back in the 80s, but it wasn't started internally. There was a big land conservation movement on Block Island that attracted a lot of national and even international organizations like the Nature Conservancy, and they had a need for mapping to try and conserve the land. They were trying to piece together contiguous parcels of land that they could retain for species and habitat protection. They needed to go raise money, and so to be able to tell that story, they needed maps to show what they were trying to buy.
Right. Okay.
Maps of where the parcels fit together, maybe where they abutted ocean or other conserved land. So those groups really externally created the mapping program on Block Island along with the University of Rhode Island, and then it grew from there.
And didn't you tell me that as a summer job you would collect data sometimes?
Yeah, it's actually one of the, I was already kind of into the GIS space in college and was doing some internships at some engineering firms. And the water utility had seen what the town had done with their mapping for open space and rights of way and parcel management. And they asked me if I would basically help them launch a GIS for the water utility. So it was fun. It was everything from figuring out how we were going to do it to creating project management plans, and then I was actually boots on the ground with the big backpack and the big GPS pole, going out and GPSing all the valves and digitizing in the mains, and that was one of my earlier practical experiences.
Well, that sounds like you got in early and got on the ground floor. Hey, before we get into the deeper part of this discussion, I want to just thank everybody who's on. 2 housekeeping items. Look, I consume a lot of these live broadcasts, and the best way to do it is to turn it on and do your work and then listen, and if you hear Dan and I talking about something that interests you, just pull yourself away and focus on what we're talking about. I certainly don't expect you just to focus in on my the glare on my glasses for the next 30 minutes. Anyway, and then secondly, if you're watching, I've got a couple messages here, but I'd love to see where the different people who are watching are at. So if you're watching, just go to the comments and just put in the comment where you are and where you're watching from. That would be really helpful to give us a sense of who's on today. That'd be really helpful. Now, Dan, you working on the Block Island GIS, that brings to mind this. You've been involved in a lot of different kinds of GIS projects through your tenure at Critigen. We want to talk specifically today. One of the things we want to talk about is, just the return on investment that GIS programs have in the marketplace. So I just want to ask you, give us some examples of some of the big programs you've worked on. And a little bit about, what those programs did and why they were important.
Yeah, absolutely. And Bruce, if I could take a moment just to share a point of contrast, because we talked about that start at the Block Island Water Company, and I'll contrast that to some of the big programs I've been fortunate to work on recently. But I was once chatting with Kevin Kirk at Esri. Him and I were just bantering about, and I said, Kevin, I think I've worked for the smallest utility in the country. They've only got 400 meters. And he said, no. He said the smallest customer is Disney. They've got 1 meter and 1 utility. And clever.
He got you there. He got you there.
No, but thanks. And so, the challenges that large tier 1 utilities face are in some ways the same, but in many ways very different than smaller organizations. And they're dealing with a more complex set of problems because of, running a large business, the number of different types of systems that they have deployed, the complexity of their field force, the fact that they're often have evolved from mergers and acquisitions. So you've had a lot of different smaller companies that are now trying to operate as one larger one. And so we've had a lot of experience in those types of settings with gas and electric utilities. And one that more recently comes to mind was, it was a GIS consolidation. It was a utility network project, but that wasn't really the driver. The impetus was they were really overhauling the entire operations of the gas business, short of perhaps HR and financials. So, it was the ERP backbone, it was work management, it was their customer, both customer facing and customer back office. And through looking at how they're really going to transform the way they do business on a multi-year, even decade-long horizon, they really just saw the need that they needed to elevate GIS out of sort of a departmental level system into an enterprise system that could feed a lot of those other objectives.
That brings to mind a point. It hasn't been that many years that the GIS was kind of stuck in engineering as an operational tool, something like in a silo somewhere. And here we are in this environment where a lot of the GIS programs are joining the whole IT landscape of an enterprise. And that really changes the way that they do their business and changes the way that they operate vis-a-vis the rest of the technology in the enterprise, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. It's no longer, the GIS is no longer a map or just a system of record of where the assets exist. It's now a transactional system that is both consuming and feeding a lot of data about the constantly changing nature of the assets.
So we talked a little bit. So let's kind of combine this with the idea of consolidating GISs, right? So what are some of the challenges? Let's say you got a big gas business that's a conglomeration of, say, 6 smaller gas companies. What are some of the challenges that you run into in doing that GIS consolidation? Where's the ROI there? What's the important? Where do you find the money in a program like that?
Yeah. Well, I'll go back to kind of what the impetus is. So, it can be harder to articulate ROI in a pure GIS consolidation. I believe it's there. I believe it exists. It's just more challenging at times to advocate for it. It becomes much more straightforward and obvious when you're thinking about the fact that as you're consolidating perhaps your ERP, your work management systems, your enterprise asset management systems, your customer systems, when you're modernizing and consolidating those as part of a large program, and you start to look at the opportunities that exist to spatially enable those capabilities, and then you look tactically at what it would take to achieve that, and you've got a GIS that's maybe disparate. You've got 3 or 4 or 5 different ones, perhaps on different software platforms, certainly different versions. They've kind of grown up in their own 4 or 5 silos. And you look at not only the cost, but the complexity of trying to integrate, say, one enterprise asset management system with 5 different GIS systems. And it can not only become cost prohibitive, but just a logistical nightmare.
Interesting. And what are some of the data challenges? I'm curious, like if you've got some different GIS systems, not all of them Esri, for example, what are some of the data challenges that you run into pulling something like that off?
Yeah, and I'm far from the technical expert, but the obvious things that come to mind, you've got different data models with different structures. You're going to have different varying degrees of accuracy and completeness, because again, when you think about the fact that perhaps this one entity evolved from the merger and acquisition of several independent operating companies, what was important for each one to collect from a data standpoint could be drastically different. But of course, when you think about a combined entity, all the data needs to be there. So you end up in a data cleansing exercise, and then sometimes a data capture and creation exercise, so that you really have standardization across the data structure in what would become your combined consolidated GIS.
Okay. I know the program you're talking about, and we don't want to divulge any customers at this point, but I remember the program you're talking about, and it's very complicated, starting with a move from ArcGIS Enterprise to ArcGIS Pro. I think wasn't it a utility network implementation as well?
Yeah, it was, and I mean, we're just referencing that example because it comes, top of mind to you and I. But it's ubiquitous in the industry. I would say, this is the rule, not the exception. Most organizations find themselves in this situation today, aside from the few that have taken very recent steps to consolidate. So we'll stick with the example in mind, though, and it wasn't even just coming from one Esri system and then consolidating. It wasn't just coming from disparate Esri systems onto a single consolidated modern Esri system. In fact, it was there were a couple of GE Small World instances running in some of those operating companies. There was a more esoteric GIS that I frankly hadn't even heard of. I was embarrassed to say that until I realized nobody else had heard of them either, NRG. And so, yeah, that was a relief when I realized I wasn't the only one.
No, I'm not the only one. No.
Yeah, and so it was not only a migration from those platforms onto Esri, but then it also was implementing what became the first utility network implementation in the industry.
That's awesome. Let me take just a second before we kind of move on to the next topic that you and I had talked about. I think we've got about 25 people on today, and thank you for coming. Appreciate you listening in. If you have a question, today we're talking about GIS programs, and specifically we're talking a little bit, kind of getting a discussion going about where the ROI is on those big programs. Dan's got a lot of experience in that area, so I want to kind of dive a little deeper into that. But if you have a question about how these programs work best, or just anything that occurs to you that you think Dan could answer, he's here. He's the answer man today. All right. So let's make him work for his lunch today. Going back then, just really briefly before we leave that, there was also an integration, like a field work integration, work order management system integration, as well as a mobility implementation, a real GIS mobility implementation as well. So I just want to take the whole thing and say, when you designed that scope, right? You and Jamie Crawford helped to design that scope of work. What comes first and why? Like, is there a certain order where you have to do this work in a certain order, and why do you have it in that order?
Yeah, no, thanks, Bruce. And just to state the obvious, very, very deep team that supports us. Jamie and I just happen to be the ones that had to make it cohesive and make sure it made sense for our client partner of ours. But deep bench of talent that does all the hard thinking. But
understood. And we say often at Critigen that our people make the difference, and that's absolutely the truth. So, all right, so keep going.
So you're absolutely right. Sequencing matters, and listen. Many utilities will sequence that. You talked about integrating with enterprise asset management. We talked about mobility. I would add to that risk models. We might hit on that, elsewhere. There could be integration with customer. There could be integration with asset investment planning tools. There's a whole range. And many utilities will sequence that over time, right? And that's very common. We have seen a few instances that have been successful where, rather than sequencing that over long periods of time, they'll sort of tackle all that at once. And there can be some benefits to doing that, because as you're iterating, and I'll come back to answer your question about how do you develop the road.
You're going where I want you to go. It's all right.
There can be some benefits of doing it all at once or at the same time, because as you're in the implementation phase and requirements are changing and evolving, you can sort of bring everything together at the same time, rather than having to try and plan today what the world's going to look like 2 years from now, so to speak. But in a strategic road mapping, multi-year phased approach, there are a lot of options in how you sequence your GIS investments with the other technologies. But the one that I would say is pretty important to get right is you don't want to be upgrading your enterprise asset management system ahead of a major GIS data model change.
Okay, all right.
It's so tightly coupled that you'll end up doing a pretty significant amount of rework to your EAM integration when you dramatically change your GIS data model. So you
get your GIS modernization or migration, whatever you're talking about, you get that done and settled before you actually do that EAM implementation or upgrade or modification.
Life gets easier if you do it ahead of time, or at least in parallel.
Okay.
Right? Opposed to doing the GIS last. Now, there can be some nuance even within that. And I think what's most important is to get the data model right. When we think about the utility network, that also has a connectivity model. And there are ways that you can sort of take some logical steps without fully implementing the utility network. But you want to make sure you get the data model, the foundational elements, pretty standardized, pretty solidified rather, before you do an EAM integration.
That totally makes sense. And that's kind of what I was getting at in sequencing, is that you when you do the first things first, you avoid a certain amount of rework, right? If you get it in the right order. And when you and I were preparing a little bit our thoughts for this, that was one of those thoughts that captured my attention was, what did you call it? No regrets. What'd you call that? What was that, your phrase?
Some no regrets investments.
No regrets investments. And I think I understood you by saying the no regrets investments are things where you're maybe taking some cost up front to avoid a whole bunch of cost in the end. Is that what I gathered?
I think that's a fair way to say it.
Dan, just a sec. I'm sorry. Veer Singh wanted me to say hi, and he said, I hope you remember me. So
I absolutely do, Veer. Nice to see you.
All right. Go ahead.
So I think that's a fair way to characterize it, Bruce. That maybe is one way to think of a no regrets investment. I also think about it as it's work I'm going to do anyway at some point. I must do it. And so if I do it sooner, it is the same cost, but it avoids some rework potentially in some other area of my program or my transformation. And
Okay.
An example of that.
I've worked with you on a couple of these scoping exercises, and one of those things that is really impressive to me is that it seems to me like you really have the value to the customer is the first thing that you consider. I mean, we know that Critigen wants to make a profit from our work, but it seems to me like you always kind of put the value of the customer up front, knowing that if you do the right thing, that will pay off in the end for us.
Well, all you have to stand on, the only currency in life is your reputation, right? So,
right.
That's certainly, we're playing a long game here, not a short one.
Absolutely. Well, while we're talking about GIS value, something has come up recently in our interaction and in the marketplace, I think is worth talking about. And the listeners may or may not be current on pipeline risk models and how you do that risk assessment. The new way of doing risk assessments, I think that risk assessments used to be done in a spreadsheet for the most part. I think they're moving into the modern age now, and the new way of doing risk assessments relies heavily on GIS data. Maybe you could talk about why that is, what data it's relying on, and why it's important that you get the GIS right in that situation.
Yeah, thanks. And this also comes from some pretty recent experience, also going back a few years. But the most recent example, and this ties into your theme of a no regrets investment. We've been working with some partners and with a customer of ours who, very much in the way we just described, knew they had a multi-year roadmap to modernizing not only their GIS, but a lot of the other systems we've been discussing today, ERP, being a primary one. They knew that was on the horizon. It was already in the plans. And in the meantime, they had some requirements to tackle an upgrade, or maybe say get more sophisticated with their approach to risk modeling. Now, Bruce, you and I, we were talking earlier, risk, the first thing that jumps to mind is insurance.
Insurance, yeah. That's why I wanted to say this is pipeline risk modeling. We're not talking about like Critigen selling insurance for these big programs, right? We're talking about that risk model that helps pipeline companies or utilities or gas distribution companies to understand the risks that their pipelines are posing to the community, right?
That's exactly right. And they think about that in terms of the likelihood of failure of an asset, and then the consequence. So is it near a hospital, a school, versus a field in the middle of nowhere would be an example.
Right.
And so you're absolutely right. They wanted to get more sophisticated in their ability to and I'm going to use this word intentionally. They used to do a qualitative risk assessment, and that's kind of common in the industry today. So you're using a lot of tribal knowledge about, where the biggest risks are. And the goal here moving forward is to move to a more quantitative, scoring-based approach, more analytic approach to risk. And so you asked the question, how does the GIS play into that? And we know that GIS holds the location of the assets. That's critically important for understanding risk in the ways we just described. But it also the GIS also contains a lot of other information that's valuable. So an example would be the material of a pipe, the age of a pipe, the soil type that the pipe sits in, and you match the pipe material type with the soil type, that gives you a corrosivity. And so those are a few examples. The other one I love to go to is historic leak detection. So
Okay.
there have been a lot of leaks on a pipeline historically, and can we glean some proactive approaches to where that might pose the biggest risk? And
have those risks been in the past? Where have we kept data about say leaks? Where have we kept that data, and how is it different today?
yeah, so you'll see a few things. Spreadsheets still are not uncommon. You could certainly see information about leaks stored in an asset management or a work management system, as well as in the GIS. And what's interesting is we almost always find with many of our clients, as we go through a data profiling exercise, we find that, and I'll just make up the numbers here. Let's say there are 10,000 leaks in the work management system. 50% of those might be in the GIS. And of course, when you try to integrate those two, you realize, well, now we don't have confidence in either system. And there's sort of an exercise to get those into alignment. And going back to your original point, the goal is to have a reliable, quantitative risk model. And the GIS is really an enabling technology and providing the data to run that type of assessment.
Right. We got a comment from Jim Reed. I know he's in Raleigh, North Carolina. And Jim says he worked in the oil and gas place industry in Texas, and he was amazed at how little of the data was digitized, let alone spatially correct. And I think you find very similar, you have very similar feelings as you're evaluating what needs to be done, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And when we think about leaks being maintained in a spreadsheet, though that's becoming unfortunately a little bit less common today, but it still exists. It could have a lat long tied to it, or it could just have an address. And of course, an address is far from where the actual, a physical address, a postal address, a street address, which we know can be very far from where the actual pipe or the actual leak might exist. And those are just examples.
Right, for sure. Well, those are good examples. I really, you touch so many parts of our business, Dan. There are so many places that you are involved in our business. One of the things some of these more complex deals that involve mergers and that involve large SIs that maybe we're working for or with. What are the biggest challenges you find in a program, a large program that involves maybe a big acquisition, and also there's a lot of SIs buying for that work? What are some of those challenges you run into when you're trying to navigate around work like that?
Relationships always, right? The work's always the easy part. The relationships in life are always the harder part. And frankly, the upside of that is they're the more meaningful part, to be honest. And that goes with our partners as well as with our clients. So it's both the hardest, but it's also the greatest joy. And of course, when the train's moving pretty fast down the tracks and our customers have regulatory deadlines and rate recovery requirements, they've gotten these projects funded and they need to produce results. The train can move pretty fast down the track. And I think just keeping a spirit of collaboration, keeping everybody on the same page, keeping everybody, keep the team gelling, right? It's both the hardest, but also the most meaningful part.
That's good. I am so amazed. Like when you and I are on a pipeline review call or something like that, I'm just so amazed at all the relationships and the intricacies of a deal that you keep in your head. It just like you're really talented that way. So I think we're super lucky to have you.
I appreciate the kind remark, but I hope the mind doesn't become too much more porous over the next 20, 25 years.
You got it. So I was starting to say, I kind of got waylaid here, but starting to say you touch so many different parts of our business. I want to have you on again and maybe, dive a little deeper into some of these, maybe bring up some other different types of work you've been involved in and how that relates to, the marketplace today. I've said when I first started the Graybeard Live, my purpose here is to interact with people in the GIS space that are on LinkedIn and be able to expose the people that I work with to you guys, because I think we have a lot of value to offer Not because we want to go to work for you necessarily, but I think we just have a lot of value to offer the industry. And having Dan in front of this audience, I think, is a really important step toward getting that value out into the industry. So thanks for being on today, Dan, and everybody who's come today. I really appreciate you coming. We're going to have one of our superstars in the next week or two, not next week, but a couple weeks after that. Jamie Crawford's going to be on, and I'm probably just going to wind her up and let her go. So join me for that one. And I'll let you know when it is. And we started doing this differently, where I've created a LinkedIn event, and then the event notification will come to you as an invitation. You can accept it or not, and we'll continue to do these Graybeard Live segments through those LinkedIn events until that doesn't work. So let's watch for this to happen again. Watch for another event that you might want to listen to with one ear, and let's come back here again another time, Dan. Okay.
Thanks, Bruce. Thanks for having me on, and I'll be tuning in a few weeks.
Excellent. Okay. Well, I think you're going to go fishing this afternoon, aren't you?
I'm hoping so. We've got some rain coming in, but that usually turns the bite on pretty hot. So we're going to give it
go get yourself a striper, buddy. All right.
I'll keep you posted.
Good to talk to you. We'll talk soon again. Okay.
Thanks.
Ciao.